Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to my next podcast. I am Wanda Curley, your authority on project, program, and portfolio management. This podcast is brought to you by PM Powered, a consulting firm that can help you with your project, program, and portfolio management needs. So let's get started. Last week I talked about failed projects. This week I'm going to continue to talk about failed projects and bring in the PM-powered model to see how it affects these projects and if it would have been any better. What failed? What caused it to fail? So this week I'm going to pick a little bit on IT, although there was a little bit of IT last week, but there were also some business ones. So this week we're going to just focus on IT, and it's from the U.S., Canada, and England, but I'm going to particularly pick on the U.S. So let's go to the first one, and this first one is from the Los Angeles Unified School District. And I was absolutely amazed and disappointed in this because this is funds that are being taken away from student learning, and it's absolutely tragic that this is happening. So this is the Los Angeles Unified School District, which is in California. The project type was a new payroll system. And the new payroll system goes seriously wrong. Some teachers were paid $10,000 for 1 month's work, while others received just 20 cents for the same job. Can you imagine that? I mean, to me, that's just horrible. So some school board employees are forced to take bank loans to cover their daily expenses, while Los Angeles Unified School District takes up to 1 full year to correct the problems. The problems lead to $53 million in overpayments to state employees, and an additional $37 million is spent to get the system working correctly and cover costs due to the problems caused. The originally planned final phase 3, is never completed, resulting in further lost opportunity costs. So in December of 2008, the school district secures an $18 million settlement from the contractor who installed the system. So what are the contributing factors according to the analysis that was done? It was poor management is one, obviously. Difficulty cleansing legacy data. That is the failure of many, many projects, is cleaning up the legacy data. Breakdown in training and team competency issues. Project manager, where were you? What happened with this? That seems to me like the political rationality was not understood. There are politics on every project. And if you don't understand the politics of the organization, then you're doomed to failure. You have to also bring your teams so that they understand the political part of their project, because they're dealing with the customer as well. So you have to make sure that your that your team leaders and your team, and your team understand what's going on. And so you have to understand how your team thinks. Are they coach playmakers? Are they rainmakers? What are they? They've got to understand what they are doing in that. So are they detail oriented? If they're detail oriented, they're rock stars. Coach playmakers see the forest for the trees. And then your rainmakers are strategic thinking folks. And you've got to make sure that they understand what's going on. And around this is neuroscience. And the neuroscience of it all brings in the human emphasis. Human emphasis is the power that it drives a project. The people on the project drive the project. You as the project manager have the power to drive the project, and you didn't use that power. So what happened? And there's fault on both sides. So let's understand. You've got to understand what's going on your project, because there's the triangle. There's finances, and finances went ultimately wrong on this. There's variables. There's all kinds of variables on this project, and you didn't bring them into account. And then there's time. You can't do anything about time, but you can do things about finance, and you can do things about variables. But obviously this wasn't done, so one of those or both of those sides collapsed, and when that happens, the project collapsed. That's what happened on this one. So let's go to another one, which again is in the Los Angeles Unified School District, and this one is very sad, very, very sad. It was an e-enabled learning tool or an iPad The project name was Instructional Technology Initiative, and the cost was $1.3 billion, that's with a B, billion dollars. So what they had tried to do was bring equal opportunity to all students in the, no matter what their economic backgrounds, and they wanted to bring everybody to the same level as far as technology. So the Los Angeles Unified School District efforts to provide every student, every teacher, and every administrator with an iPad turned into a debacle that has fingers pointing and red faces across the board. It was launched in 2013, and it called for more than 100,000 iPads. I'm sure Apple was happy to be purchased. Some were to be loaded with apps containing curriculum that would be used for instructional purposes, while others were to be used for standardized testing. From the initial rollout of the platforms, the iPads, there were problems. Students were quickly able to bypass the built-in security to access non-authorized content, while authorized content that was provided suffered its own quality problems. So students are very savvy, especially technology. Students that understand technology, they were able to bypass the system. And knowing students, they probably passed this on to other students that weren't as technology savvy so they could do the same thing. And there's no excuse for the content that was authorized to have quality problems. This should have been tested, retested, and tested again. Reports indicate that the authorized content was not written in accordance with applicable teaching standards. How could this happen? Where were the people testing it? Where were the people overlooking the quality? And those problems were compounded by the fact that the system suffered reliability problems that frequently rendered the content inaccessible. Can you imagine that? So the content that you're able to get to, you can't even get to. So what are students going to do? They're obviously going to bypass it. The project's director publicly criticized the system, saying, making the materials usable has required extraordinary, unsustainable, and unscalable resources. Publishing an open correspondence, the director reports that only 2 of the 69 schools in the initial pilot were still attempting to use the tool. The remaining schools had given up, noting that less than 5% of the target student body had reliable access to the content. The letter also noted that even when used, the content failed to meet all appropriate requirements. Can you imagine that in the pilot? There were 69 schools and only 2 are currently still using the product. That's sad. Failure to gain stakeholder support, missing requirements, quality-related issues, failure to fully recognize the transformational shift in learning that E-enabled learning represents. You can't just hand out iPads to individuals and expect it to be a success. Not everybody understands the technology, especially some of the older generation. They may have a more training requirements than others. And this was a quick failure of understanding organizational change. And there's organizational change in any project. It may be very little, but there is organizational change. So what were some of the other contributing factors? Failure to gain stakeholder support. If your teachers aren't using it, guess what? Your students aren't going to use it correctly. Missing requirements. If you missed requirements, it's going to be a debacle, and that's what happened here. Quality-related issues, that goes without saying. Failure to fully recognize the transformational shift in learning that E-enabled learning represents. Organizational shift requires great understanding of your organization. So what happened here? Again, the variables failed. They were failed to be recognized. That brought down the triangle, and the triangle's variables, financial and time. Inside of it is the human emphasis, which is the power of the project manager. I would hope there was a project manager on both sides. I would imagine that the company that was implementing this had a project manager. If not, shame on them. And the school system should have had a project manager as well. I'm going to guess that maybe they didn't. They just assigned a teacher that had to continue with his or her own teaching duties while doing this as a side duty. That can't be done. You've got to be able to do this without that. So what else happened? The political rationality was not understood. The understanding of the stakeholders was not understood. This is a failure on the part of the project manager. You've got to understand what's going on with your stakeholders and with your end users. And if you don't understand the political rationality which drives a project. So let's go on to another project here. And this one is the Ontario Ministry of Community and Social Services. Again, this is Canada. It was the Welfare Management System, Social Assistance Management System. It was called SAMS. It was in March 2015, and the cost was $214 million Canadian dollars. It's a narrative that journalists and popular opinion love to draw upon. Government can't run projects. And we're seeing that, and I am focusing on just projects that failed. In a future podcast, I will look at projects that were successful and understand why it was successful. But let's continue with this Canadian project. While such journalists are often overlooking the many successes governments have, the Ontario Ministry of Community and Social Services has put itself into the journalist crosshairs with the launch of new SAMS system introduced in November 2014. The SAMS system allows municipalities to control welfare payments payable under the Ontario Works and the Ontario Disability Support Programs. I want to provide a little bit of background on this that was brought into this. The previous welfare payment system also failed, and they did not learn from that. That is terrible. Lessons learned should have been kept on the previous one. I'm going to guess that they weren't, or if they were ignored, or it was not, there was enough turnover of staff that they did not know that there was anything there. So providing income support to those in need, the program helps people with disabilities who are financial need pay for living expenses like food and housing. So this is a part of the population that absolutely needs to have the income. A lifeline for many, the introduction of new SAMS system has turned into a headache for the municipal staff who operate the system at the city level and for those receiving payments. Shortly after the system's launch in November 2014, the system erroneously overpaid, totaling 20 million Canadian dollars to 17,000 recipients. This required manual intervention and follow-up directly with the province, but yet they have yet to recover much of the overpayments. I'm sure these people that received the payment did not understand it was an overpayment and just paid the money, used the money to pay bills. Others, I'm sure, understood it was an overpayment, but they had bills as well, so they just paid and got caught up. Other problems reported included payment of incorrect amounts, either too much or too little. Can you imagine those that received too little? Financial records being inaccurate, the database not reflecting the value of the checks issued, and checks being sent to incorrect addresses. It sounds like the legacy data was not cleaned up. Requiring significant overtime from municipal staff, and there wasn't the overtime funds to do it. Let's see, and training costs associated with SAMS implementation. 5 months after its launch, cities report that the problems are ongoing, and Ontario government has been forced to pay millions in additional payments to the cities to accommodate the problems. One of the things that makes SAM's project stand out is a good illustration of how some organizations don't seem to learn from past projects. And that's what I was telling you. The previous project was called SDMT, Systems Delivery Model Technology. It suffered major issues as well. It saw a cost overrun of $284 million that ballooned to $500 million. So this was an IBM effort, and it failed. I don't want to pick on IBM, but it seems that they've had a lot of failures lately. So there was lack of quality of control, launching the product before it was ready, and challenges in defining the requirements fully, ineffectual training. So again, the variables were not understood. The project manager didn't use the power that he or she should have had to identify those, sit with the stakeholders, sit with the end users and understand what was going on and understanding how to pay it. This is something that project managers sometimes overlook, the understanding that planning is so important because they get that push from those that are on there saying, go ahead and start doing the work. Planning doesn't need to be done. You're just doing paperwork. Let's do it. You've got to plan. If not, your variables will fail and it brings down the whole project. And that's what happened on here. So let's talk about a British Home Office. So this was in the UK. It was immigration controls, and we can identify with that here in the US. It was called e-borders, and there was it cost 224 million sterling pounds. It was March 2014. So with changing security threats, securing a country's border has become an ever-increasing priority. The United Kingdom's effort to secure their borders has suffered a significant setback after the now called e-borders project has resulted in a 224 million sterling pound settlement in favor of the supplier of the system. So it was brought to arbitration, and the company that was inputting this was Raytheon, and they won a settlement of 224 million sterling pounds because of the ineffective nature of what happened on the British side. There was $50 million in damages, not dollars, sorry, sterling pound, 126 million sterling pounds for work completed prior to the contract being terminated, 10 million to settle complaints relating to changes to the original contract, and 38 million sterling pounds in interest payments. So you already can see that there was 10 million to settle complaints relating to changes. So it sounds like the requirements weren't completely understood at the beginning of this project, and subject matter experts were not brought in to understand the project. Not on the contractor's part, but on the government's part. So my hat's off to the contractors for trying to push and get it through. Obviously, if it went to arbitration and they won, and the Raytheon won, then it was fault on the British side. However, there's always fault on each side. So the Raytheon could have said cease and desist until we get things in order, but the British Brits, the government had the opportunity to also say cease and desist until we get things in order. But it sounds like neither party was wanting to do this. And I'm guessing here, I don't know that for a fact, but requirements obviously were not understood. But my hat's off to Raytheon for trying to get this done. A boo to the British government for not having a project manager that understood what was going on. I'm going to assume that Prince 2 is used for the methodology, and this was obviously not done because Prince 2 is very comprehensive on what it does. So let's go to another government IT project, and this one has to do with the Affordable Care Act, or also called Obamacare by many. So it was in the USA. It's an e-commerce marketplace. The date was October 2013. The cost is unknown. So that means it was in the millions, maybe even billions of dollars. That is incomprehensible to me that we don't know the total amount of the failure on this project. And that's because there were so many different government agencies involved that we don't know how much each agency added into the Affordable Care Act. So when the President of the United States, which was Obama, has to address the issue in front of the whole nation, you know you've created a serious problem. So the Affordable Care Act of 2010 is President Obama's signature legislative accomplishment aimed at bringing down affordable health care to millions of people who otherwise would go unprotected. It was a debacle in many senses because insurance companies canceled insurance for many of their insured individuals and told them to use ACA, and it ended up being a disaster. I actually tried to log on to the system and I was denied entry. I kept on receiving an error, and that's one of the things that they're talked about. It was very slow. They underestimated the amount of people that would be using it. There were too many government agencies involved without any one being in charge, or if there was one in charge, they weren't able to manage the other ones. There were too many different contractors brought in, and they were each siloed. They were doing their part, and it wasn't managed as a program as it should have been. So what were some of the contributing factors that happened on this? Undersizing of infrastructure. And I actually worked for a company that helped resolve some of this. It was done in the background. It was kept quiet, and I'm going to be quiet as to which company it was that I worked with. But they had to bring in their own servers to turn this around. So it was a debacle. And Accenture was brought in after the original project company couldn't do it. So undersizing of infrastructure due to failure to correctly forecast performance and throughput requirements, schedule pressure resulting in lack of time for appropriate testing. So in other words, the date drove the work, and as it turned out, when they launched, it didn't launch correctly. Silos between contractors and departments participating in the project resulting in communication issues, underestimations of complexity. Boy, did they underestimate the complexity. My hat's off to Accenture and all of their subcontractors that were brought in and understood the complexity, and they brought it under control. They still had some issues, but communication was done better, and it was understood better. What did they do correctly? Well, one of the things was they understood the political rationality. So they were able to understand the strategic focus on this. They were able to bring in creative thinking into this project, because this project, actually it was a program, couldn't be your traditional IT. It had to be done creatively because it was something massive that had never been done in the United States. We don't have a socialized care system, so we didn't even understand how many people out there would need affordable care. So the variables, again, on the original project weren't understood. The power of the project managers involved, they didn't bring in their power. They didn't put their foot down and say, this is wrong. We're not communicating correctly. We have got to stop. We've got to delay the launch. Nobody wanted to delay the launch. They were fixated on the date without understanding what their technology was. So boo to the project managers of the government side who originally did this and didn't understand what they were doing, and boo to the original contractors on the contractor's project management side. So let's go to another one that also had to do with the Affordable Care Act, and this was the state of Minnesota. So the states in the United States, when they were doing the Affordable Care Act, had the option of using the government one, or they could use their own one. Well, IBM came out with a solution, so they said, to have an e-commerce marketplace for healthcare. And again, Obamacare allowed states to either come onto the federal one, which had its own problems, or use their own. So the state of Minnesota decided to do their own Affordable Care Act e-commerce marketplace, and it was called MNsure. And they brought in IBM, and IBM had its own system, and it was called CURAM, C-U-R-A-M. So the CURAM solution for healthcare reform. Minnesota was one of the first states to do this, and it was a huge, huge, huge debacle. So they, instead of using the federal government, which, like I said, had its own problem, they used their own. And so they were developing their own system from scratch, but it was appealing to them that IBM had a solution that they could bring on. So they ended up having blinders because they thought this was a system that the CURAM product would be the MNsure system, was intended to bring the state of Minnesota into compliance with the federal government's ACA requirements. And as with many large IT-enabled projects, a number of contractors were involved. According to reports, Maximums from Reston, Virginia was the prime contractor, while IBM provided the CURAM-based system that determined whether applicants are eligible for the public program. it was based on federal tax credits to help offset the cost of the private insurance available in the marketplace. So Minnesota knew which healthcare providers they had, insurance providers, and it ended up being an absolute disaster. So the company that they were brought in to oversee it didn't understand the IBM system, and IBM actually, I'm going to guess, drove the system because they had the biggest part of it, even though the project manager that was brought in for the state of Minnesota didn't understand how to do their job. So what happened was there was a robust letter, as they called, from the Minnesota governor, Mark Dayton, and it was sent to the IBM CEO. It wasn't even sent to the program sponsor. It was sent to the IBM CEO requesting immediate action. That letter has now been made public and reveals details the types of problems the Minnesota government was facing operating the system. The Curam product is the focus of the letter, which alleges, among other things, that Curam product did not properly perform eligibility determinations or verify individuals' applications information as required under federal law. The fact that this functionality was not working was known to Curam staff. That is criminal, in my opinion, but was not communicated to MNsure. The letter then includes a 3-page long list of defects originating in the MNsure system that needed urgent attention. To IBM's credit, it appears they did respond swiftly to the governor's letter and did send an army of specialists, and that's what IBM always does when they get something like that, to address the problems. However, as with many such problems, once they are in the system, it can be a tough job to get them out. Reports from the Star Tribune in Minnesota indicate that the problems with MNsure are contributing into January 2014. There was also the system from Curam was used in Maryland and Hawaii and probably other states, and they had the same system. It's criminal, in my opinion, that IBM launched a system where they knew it wouldn't even work, and they didn't let these people know that they would have to fix it as they were going along. So what were some of the contributing factors? That was one of them. Initial inquiries by Minnesota state government are now being conducted. However, the governor's letter implies problems with requirements management, quality management, and communications. Failure to appreciate the complexity of integrating a new system with existing systems. As an outside observer, I also wonder if Minnesota underestimated the risk. While Curam may be an off-the-shelf product, given that the ACA requirements only came into effect in October 2013, it was an unproven product at the time that it was selected. There is a big difference between off-the-shelf unproven and off-the-shelf proven. So in other words, I hate to say it, it sounds like IBM was selling vaporware. That means they were selling a system that either wasn't up to speed, and it sounds like it wasn't, or it really didn't exist. So IBM, shame on you. Shame on Minnesota government for not looking into the system properly, looking at making sure that it worked. Now, maybe IBM put a system together that looked like it was working. So I don't know exactly where it went wrong. But again, the variables on this absolutely failed, and the political rationality was not understood. Requirements management are part of your variables, and if they don't understand the requirements on this, or got bluffed into thinking that the requirements were done then by the system, then shame on you on the Minnesota side. I don't understand why IBM would do this. IBM has had many debacles in the past where they've tried to sell something that was ineffective or was not complete. If they had been transparent about it, maybe they wouldn't have made the sale, but Minnesota wouldn't have had this debacle in the sense, because they could have done the risk management against it, and this evidently wasn't done. Minnesota also had blinders on to thinking that an off-the-shelf product would work without some major risk. Any off-the-shelf product, even if it's proven, has risk. MS Project is a proven off-the-shelf product, but it's very complex. And I imagine that this ACA Curam product was very complex. If you're implementing MS Project into an organization, you have to have the training. And it sounds like not only did they not have proper training on this, but also that it was an unproven product. So there is risk, especially with that. And since Minnesota was one of the first, along with Maryland and Hawaii, there should have been some talk between companies, between states, to understand what was going on. This didn't happen. So the political rationality wasn't understood by IBM on the state of Minnesota and Hawaii and Maryland. So shame on you. Let's go on to my last one, and this has to do with the British Broadcasting Company. It was Digital Media Initiative. It was May 2013, and it was 100 million sterling pound. And so the British Broadcasting Company, BBC, which I listen to all the time, it's a great place to get your news. It was started in 1922. It's owned by the British government, but they are kind of independent, but are funded by the British government. What they were trying to do was to improve efficiency when creating new materials and to allow for better management and integration of archive materials. The BBC initiated the Digital Media Initiative in 2008. DMI was intended to provide a single tool that would enable video and radio production from raw materials through the final edit. Well, what happened, they hired Siemens to do this. After 18 months at a cost of 82 million sterling pounds, and it was a fixed price contract, so all of the overcost should have been absorbed by Siemens, but this didn't happen. They canceled the project. It was a no-fault termination of the contract, and they brought the project in-house. So an independent report by the National Audit Office at the time made note of the failure to conduct a competitive tender process. So it was single source to Siemens, which was a mistake. And I can't imagine that the British government doesn't have something in place that says you can't do a single source contract for such a big thing. And made a number of recommendations to help ensure the system could be delivered by the internal team. So then it was brought into the internal team. The internal team was having all kinds of problems, but these were not communicated to the stakeholders and to the project sponsor. Everybody thought it was doing very well. So finally what happened was a senior IT person, systems integrator, wrote a letter to the sponsor and said, this thing is horribly wrong. They're not communicating to you properly. And so he eventually wrote a letter to the BBC Trust. That was the committee with governance and oversight responsibility for the BBC, telling them that they were not being given an accurate picture of the project's true status. According to reports, the letter stated that BBC Trust, the government, and other senior parties involved may have been misled about the true performance of the DMI since it was taken in-house. So Mrs. Hodge, who was then the MP, chairing the Public Accounts Committee, said this was a terrible shock and clearly completely shambolic. We were told that there were bits of the system that were working, that you were using them. That wasn't true. That just wasn't true. So 100 million sterling pounds were written off, and the findings of the inquiry are due for publication shortly. So what happened? Underestimating the complexity, ineffective governance structure, hierarchical organization structure in which accurate flows of information were actively blocked, failure to conduct an effective tendering process when selecting the original supplier, lack of contractor oversight, overstating the benefits of the project, the use of a fixed price contract acted as a barrier that discouraged the BBC from getting too deeply involved in the design stages for fear of triggering change requests, thereby nullifying the fixed price. Shame on everybody involved in this. Shame on Siemens for taking a fixed price contract when they know it should have been cost plus. Shame on everybody for not doing their jobs. The BBC should have been looking out over the design, and if changes were needed, then changes should have been done. Siemens should have been implementing changes as they saw things that were changing on the contract, but they didn't want to lose the contract, so they kept on going. Then they couldn't sustain the amount of information that was going. So what happened on this? It seems that in this triangle that PM Powered has, we have variables on the left, variables on the right, finances on the left, and time at the bottom. So you have this triangle, and if one side fails, then it starts to be heavy, and it just comes down. And as one comes down, if it comes down too far without bringing it back up, then you have a complete failure of the triangle, which has a complete failure of the project. The power within the triangle is the project manager, who must understand how people think. He or she must understand the political rationality, and this is neuroscience that brings this around. And we have three ways of thinking. We can be a rock star where we look at the details. We can be a coach or a playmaker who understands the forest for the trees. And then you can be the rainmaker, which understands strategies. And you have to have all three on a project, or else it's going to fail. And people have to have creativity. And if you force people to think in a different mode, that is good. That brings them into a creative way of thinking, because they see the project from a different angle. And it also brings in strategic thinking. You have to understand the strategy. Even if you're tactical, you have to understand the strategy of the organization or your part of the project, or else it's doomed to failure. So you have to understand the political rationality of what's going on. So I hope an analysis of these projects are bringing you insight, not only into a model that understands the neuroscience and the way people think, and it helps bring a living triangle, not the PMI stagnant triangle, the Project Management Institute's stagnant triangle, but a living triangle that can show how projects, programs, and portfolios absolutely can fail if they're not kept in check. I am Wanda Curley, your authority on project, program, and portfolio management. This podcast was brought to you by PM Powered, a consulting company that can help you with your project, program, and portfolio needs. If you log into pmcurrent.com, and please subscribe to my YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter account. I'd love to have you follow me. If you don't agree with anything that I've said on this podcast, please contact me. My email is wanda@pmpowered.com. If you were the project manager on any of these, I would love to have your perspective on this. Even if you were the failed project manager, I know I'm only seeing the failure part, but please come and talk to me and understand why it failed. Maybe it wasn't I'm going to hope that it wasn't the project manager's fault, but something that happened over and above you. And maybe you did warn the company of what was going on. So please come and talk to me if you can. I'd love to have you on this. I'd love to have the highlights. Finally, remember, every Monday is a new podcast. I would love to see you next week. Take care and see you soon.